Hi everyone, welcome to the response video for Module 12. I'm going to do this one on the two most popular questions here. One of them being, Lulia Alabed asks, how can international law be applied to those who don't have recognized states such as Palestine? Beautiful question. The reading that I think this is based on is one of my favorites, I think, in the book because it's kind of it shows something interesting. It shows why international law is important, even if nobody follows it, right? So that's good. We'll do that one, and while we're doing that, we'll answer Joseph Davis's question, which is like, do most countries respect international law? The notion of resolving disputes based on let me see if I can move it to a place where I can see it, because there's some buttons covering up that question. Do most countries respect international law? The notion of resolving disputes based on legality and not the use of force seems like a noble goal, but isn't it true that there are some states that don't respect international law? If so, then what can be done when dealing with such entities? With what degrees of exactness does the United States follow international law? Brilliant question. That's really a question that we get a lot in this class, in this section. So, and it's a solid one, right? And it's one that I think the readings, maybe all of them, are tried to address to some degree. Anyway, maybe not the first one, maybe not the NEF reading. All right, so let's have a look now. Maybe the NEF reading does. Anyway, let's focus. So how can international law be applied to those who don't have recognized status, such as Palestine? To me, one of the most interesting things about the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice is the Palestinian case. Now, before I get started, the Palestinian case is a little bit of an outlier, right? Because it's not it's kind of a state, right? A lot of other states recognize it as a state. Does it have observer status right now in the UN? So it's kind of a strange case. It has some legality, but it's not quite, and it has some recognition, but it's not quite a full member of the UN. So it's a strange case to look at. But if we do look at it, it tells us something interesting. And what it tells us is this, is that international law, and specifically these international legal bodies like the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, they can confer status on an entity that would be a state like Palestine. So, and it's sort of clever how they do it. So I think a case that's right now before which court is the ICJ, I imagine it must be. There's currently the Palestinians are trying to bring a case in, and one of our readings talks about this. If I can find it. You've probably already read it, right? So you've probably already found. But it's in the, I forgot what the title is, but everything I'm about to say comes from that reading. So you'll recognize it if you've done the reading, and if not, go back and sort of fill this out because it's interesting. All right. So actually, I know a little bit more about the case since this was written. It's ongoing right now. At least it was as of about a month ago. So Palestine are trying to bring a case against the United States. And the case that they're trying to bring is that the United States should not recognize, it's illegal for the United States to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, to unilaterally recognize them and to build their embassy there, to move their embassy there. Now, there's every chance that this is not illegal. Right? There's every chance that the United States can do that if it wants to do that, right? And like the second question states, even if it was against the law, there's no way that the United States, at least under the current administration, would say, oh, okay, then let's move it back. That seems like being able to put your embassy in a country or in a specific place seems to have long-standing sort of legality in international law, and for a powerful state like the United States, they can do what they want. Even if they want to contravene the law, which they don't seem to be doing in putting their embassy in Jerusalem. Anyway, so Palestine wants to bring a case against the United States. Now, there's every chance that they wouldn't win that case. So what good is international law to Palestine? Well, and this is the beauty of it, right? This is the good. So the good is this. If the International Court of Justice decides to hear Palestine's case, even if it will lose, not even to hear its case, even if the International Court of Justice accepts the application from the Palestinians. That's all it has to do. So it doesn't have to agree to hear the case. I've been saying that. It doesn't really have to agree to hear the case. It certainly doesn't have to rule in favor of Palestine. All it has to do is accept that application. Now, what the United States are doing is saying, we're not going to respond to the application of the Palestinians because Palestine is not a state. And because they're not a state, they have no legal standing. They have no standing. They have no ability to petition the court because they're not even a state. So we're not going to respond at all, which is the right tactic for the United States in terms of their foreign policy. Right? Their foreign policy is that Palestine is not a state, and so they shouldn't respond to it. Now the court gets to decide. The judges in the court now get to decide. Okay, do we accept the application from Palestine and try and force the United States to respond to it, or do we not accept it? Now, if they don't accept it, okay. And this was a month ago that I think the United States response was due a month ago, and they said we're not going to respond, so they probably haven't responded. Well, maybe a month or two ago now. Anyway, but here's the thing: whatever the timeline is, if that court now, this international body, this international legal body that's open for states, if they accept that case, if they accept that application, and they consider whether or not there is a case, if they consider whether or not there is a case, then Palestine, in the eyes of the court, is a state because it only considers applications from states. That's it. So you see how the international legal system, two things. One, whether or not it accepts, whether or not anybody listens to the rulings, whether or not it does that, this is one more, it would be one more sort of straw, I guess, on the camel's back of Palestinian statehood. Because people look at them and they're interested in them and they see them as somewhat legitimate. Even if states don't, right? Even if the United States says, no, we won't recognize any rulings from the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice, I think the International Criminal Court, I'm pretty sure the United States is not a signatory to that. So, so they don't recognize it at all. But if people, if civilians, if citizens of the United States say, oh, the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, in the case that we're discussing, is, oh, that's legitimate. That's a we hold it in reverence. We think that it's a legitimate institution and a powerful institution and an important institution. To the extent that the citizens of the world do that, right, it has some power then, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that every other state is going to abide by its rulings, but its visibility and its the respect that people have for it means that if it says Palestine's a state, then maybe Palestine is a state. Right? The same, I suppose, just to give an analogy, right? Not to sort of equate the two, but to give an analogy, right? If the Pope, right, the Pope himself and the Catholic Church doesn't really have any power over states, but if the Pope says something, people listen, right? So similarly, right, with the perhaps people will listen to the ICJ in a similar way. So that again doesn't mean that they can force the United States to do anything about it. So that's I think an answer to the first question, a direct answer to the first question, and I think it's a partial answer to the second question, right? So it's a maybe a bit of a cheeky answer to the second one, right? To the second one was saying, even if they don't respect international law, right, there still might be some use, some benefit from international law. But to sort of more directly answer it, I'll turn your attention, right, to another one of the readings, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it, which is going to be, could have looked this up before, I suppose, but it's about international law, and it's that reading where there's a study. It's like it's an experiment, I suppose, a natural experiment, where they do. They have those three hypotheses, I think, are in the book, 3 or 4 of them. But what they're trying to do is, right, what they're trying to argue is that actually that international law does have an effect. And that's not to say that all states, because you're asking, well, there are some states that don't respect international law. Undoubtedly, you're right. I have to give you that. If so, what can be done when dealing with such entities? So that part of the question I'm probably not going to answer, right, because that's probably unanswerable. But I want to give some sort of substance around this question, right? Some things for you to think about, and here they are. So this reading, it looks at disputes, territorial disputes, and their thinking is, look, states care a lot about their territory, right? They don't give up their territory willy-nilly, right? They don't agree to have international arbitration over territorial disputes willy-nilly. What if they lose? What if the international court, right, or an international arbitration set up specifically for this border dispute? What if they rule against them? They can't give up territory. Imagine if the United States gives up Alaska or something like that, right? That's impossible. If they give up Texas, it's impossible, right? It's impossible to imagine, and it's impossible to imagine the United States, but it's impossible to imagine many countries giving up parts of their territory. Not to say that it never happens, but it's very difficult, and it's very significant when it does happen. So, so they choose to look at those cases, and what they want to see is they want to see do countries do this, right? Do states agree to have international arbitration, resolve their border disputes with their neighbors? Because the implication of that is, so the wider question is, can international law solve serious disputes without resort to violence? Not just without resort to violence, although that's part of their study, but can it resolve tricky problems? Because if it can, then that's useful. Even if not every state obeys international law 100%. Right? You ask about the United States, right? What degree of exactness? Right? It's of course debatable, but maybe it's not 100%, right? And maybe not 100% of states 100% obey the international law. And that's okay. That would be too big a claim to make about international law. But it seems from the experiment and from the reading, it seems that it's not too big a claim to say, international law does make a difference, and the difference that it makes, right, is that that rather than two things, right? Rather than fight a war, right, which is one thing. Rather than fight a war, states will have independent arbitration over very serious issues. But number two, not only will they not have a war, but they will seek to resolve those disputes. Because the other option is we can have a war about it, perhaps, right, or some sort of a conflict, an economic argument, perhaps economic conflict. There's some sort of conflict about it, or we can just leave it, right? We can just say, look, I don't want to fight a war about this, but I'm also not going to give the territory up. So that's sort of a middle position where we just let it ride, right? And that then remains a potential flashpoint in the world. But what the reading finds is that actually international law, international legal bodies can solve these problems. States will choose to go and have them resolved through international law. So it's a facility, it's a tool, other than war and other kinds of conflict, that states can use to resolve problems. And the great, one of the more interesting parts of that, one of the more interesting findings, I think, from that study that, again, I call it a natural experiment, I think, is that in democracies, states with weak claims on the territory that's in dispute, states with weak claims that are democracies, will deliberately go to an independent arbitration, international arbitration, to resolve the dispute, knowing that they'll lose, in order to resolve the problem. So they're deliberately giving up that land. Now, they could not do that themselves, is the argument, right? Is the supposition from the reading. A state can't, let's use Alaska again, right? The last in, first out, right? Well, actually, Hawaii, right? Hawaii was the last in. Huh. That shows what I know. All right. Well, let's take Alaska. I don't know why. It's close to Russia. Sarah Palin can see Russia from there. Okay, so and it's, well, Hawaii is as well. But let's I don't know, stick with Alaska. Could any United States president, could any United States Congress agree to give up one of the states, even part of one of the states, even one of the islands of Hawaii? Could they do that? No, I think is the answer. Or if they did, right, they would be severely punished at a ballot box in a democracy. And this is the argument, right? The leaders of democracies, even when they have very weak claims, they'll go to arbitration. And the reason that they'll do it is because It gives them cover. They can say, look, this wasn't me. I didn't give this away. I had to give it away. The international court or the international arbiter, they made me do it. And because, again, of the thing that we talked about before, because of the respect and the reverence that the population may well have for this international court and international law, they may be dazzled by the idea of sort of human unity and human law. Because they're dazzled in this way and reverence it, then they will say, look, we understand you had to do it. That was the international law. And so now they can resolve a very difficult issue for them. A very difficult issue. They know that the land really legally isn't theirs. And of course, Alaska is very much legally the United States. So is Hawaii. I'm not trying to say that. But not only that, but they can't give it away. They don't have a legal claim to it, and they can't give it away. It's an awful dispute. We can't win it and we can't lose it. But with the help of international law and international arbitration, international legal structures, we can give it away and blame them for it. So again, we can't hold international law to too high a standard, but there's a middle way here, right, of saying international law, yes, sure, not everybody follows it 100% of the time. That's true. Yeah, there's ways around it. I think I talked about that on our last video, maybe, when we talked about the UN, and let's not call it a war, let's call it a defense. I think I talked about the Suez crisis, right? So yeah, it makes it so not only does it make us sort of justify our actions, right? We act like it's there. It has some effect, but we have to justify our actions. But also, hey, look at this. It gives us some other tool to resolve these very serious border disputes. And if we can solve very serious border disputes with this, probably there's other disputes we can solve as well. So any extra tool that works in that way might be useful. Just because not everybody follows it 100% of the time doesn't mean that we should throw it out. That'll be my answer to those questions. Hopefully that helps and gives you something to think about. And certainly, hopefully it turns you back towards those two readings, have a full understanding of what's going on in them, and that would be a good outcome from this video.